Tonight, we begin with the remarkable resilience of medieval peasants, people who endured plagues, wars, crushing taxes, and starvation, often all within the same miserable stretch of time. Before we dive in, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of storytelling. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. So settle in, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You are a medieval peasant. Your name is probably something thrilling like Illid or Mord. You own one shirt, one tooth, and one fragile hope that this year's barley harvest won't betray you the way your cousin did at last year's sheep wrestling contest. Unfortunately, fate, and by fate we mean weather, pests, and the occasional Viking, has other plans. This is the second year of back-to-back crop failures. The wheat has gone on strike, the oats have eloped with mildew, and the only thing growing in your field is resentment. Starvation in the medieval world wasn't rare. It was a recurring visitor, like taxes, only grayer and far more bitey. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, rolled across Europe like an endlessly hungry fog. Torrential rains destroyed crops. Livestock drowned in their own pastures. Grain prices skyrocketed faster than your neighbor's accusations of witchcraft. The first thing to disappear is bread. And when bread goes, so does the illusion of stability. Grain was the cornerstone of the peasant diet, not because it was delicious, but because it was usually edible and less likely to fight back. So what did you do when the granary echoed like a church on a Monday morning? You improvised. It's late autumn now, and your last goat has mysteriously vanished. Except, oddly enough, you just spotted one of its legs boiling away in your neighbor's stew pot. Coincidence? Unlikely. Welcome to famine logic, where anything with calories is either a meal or a suspect. In normal years, livestock were your wealth, your power, and your walking cheese dispensers. But in a famine year, they were last resort meals with names. Chickens gone, pigs roasted, sheep eaten down to the bell. You even eyed the ox, not for meat, but because plowing field was starting to feel optional compared to simply surviving until next week. And then the rats arrived. Actually, they were always there. But now they weren't just stealing grain. They were becoming grain. Peasants began setting traps, lighting torches, and getting creative. Roast rat on a stick. Rat broth. Rat and turn a casserole. If it twitched and ran, it was now part of the protein pyramid. Even cats weren't safe. Fluffy, who once napped on your haystack, is now suspiciously missing, and the pot smells different. Desperation also meant peasants turned to things they wouldn't have touched in ordinary misery. Hedgehogs, crunchy, squirrels, gamey frogs. Surprisingly posh if you ignore the screaming. And don't get a start on snails. The French call it escargot. Medieval peasants just called it Wednesday. Preservation became a dark art. Salting meat? You wish. Salt was too expensive. Smoking was more realistic if you had wood and a fire and a reason to pretend you weren't crying into your bone stew. Some monasteries offered a lifeline. They had better food stores, and peasants might trade labor, loyalty, or just basic silence in exchange for a warm bowl. Others bartered wildly, offering eggs that didn't exist yet, or marrying off cousins to strangers who promised soup. And yes, in some records there's talk of cannibalism, but that was usually the next village over. Yours, of course, only considered it. Through it all, rumors traveled faster than carts. A pig spotted 2 miles away, a merchant with rye, a noble who might donate leftovers. Hope was measured in crumbs and gossip. And if you still had your dog, congratulations. You either had moral restraint or he was faster than you. First came the seed grain, the portion you were supposed to save for next season. A risky move, like eating your last chess piece in the middle of a losing game. But desperation doesn't do long-term planning. Next, you turn to substitutes. Barley bread became bark bread, literally. You'd grind tree bark into flour and mix it into dough. The texture like chewing through a really aggressive contract. Then came boiled weeds, acorns, and if things got truly dire, shoe leather stew. Not for the taste, more for the mouth activity. Some peasants tried begging in town, others stole. A few very ambitious ones even joined monasteries for the free soup and eternal guilt. Surviving a famine wasn't about thriving. It was about outlasting your neighbor, preferably the one who smelled like turnips and looked a bit too interested in your cat. So, it's late autumn, and your last goat has mysteriously run away. Except you found its leg boiling in your neighbor's stew pot. Coincidence? Unlikely. Welcome to famine logic, where anything with calories is either a meal or a suspect. In normal years, livestock were your wealth, your power, and your walking cheese dispensers. But in a famine year, they were last resort meals with names. Chickens gone, pigs, roasted, sheep, eaten down to the bell. You even eyed the ox, not for meat, but because plowing fields was starting to feel optional compared to simply surviving until next week. And then the rats arrived. Actually, they were always there. But now, they weren't just stealing grain. They were becoming grain. Peasants began setting traps, lighting torches, and getting creative. Roast rat on a stick. Rat broth. Rat and turnip casserole. If it twitched and ran, it was now part of the protein pyramid. Even cats weren't safe. Fluffy, who once napped on your haystack, is now suspiciously missing, and the pot smells different. Desperation also meant peasants turned to things they wouldn't have touched in ordinary misery. Hedgehogs, crunchy, squirrels, GY frogs, surprisingly posh if you ignore the screaming. And don't get us started on snails. The French call it escargot. Medieval peasants just called it Wednesday. Preservation became a dark art. Salting meat? You wish. Salt was too expensive. Smoking was more realistic if you had wood and a fire and a reason to pretend you weren't crying into your bone stew. Some monasteries offered a lifeline. They had better food stores, and peasants might trade labor, loyalty, or just basic silence. In exchange for a warm bowl, others bartered wildly, offering eggs that didn't exist yet, or marrying off cousins to strangers who promised soup. And yes, in some records, there's talk of cannibalism, but that was usually the next village over. Yours, of course, only considered it. Through it all, rumors traveled faster than carts. A pig spotted 2 miles away, a merchant with rye, a noble who might donate leftovers. Hope was measured in crumbs and gossip. And if you still had your dog, congratulations. You either had moral restraint or he was faster than you. Let's talk about bread, the humble loaf, the peasant's best friend, and occasionally its assassin. In a famine year, grain wasn't just scarce, it was dangerously weird. If you managed to find rye or wheat, chances were it had been sitting in a damp barn for months, maybe years. You didn't ask where it came from. You didn't ask why it was glowing slightly. You just thanked the heavens and tried to bake it before it walked away. Enter ergot, a fungus that loved damp rye. Medieval folks didn't know it by name, but they knew its effects. Muscle spasms, hallucinations, burning sensations, and the fun surprise of losing limbs like medieval Lego pieces. Ergot poisoning was known as St. Anani's fire because nothing says divine intervention like bread that sets your veins on fire. So yes, the one thing you were counting on not to betray you betrayed you. Again, the baking process didn't help. Peasants often used communal ovens, and in a famine year, the ovens were like confession booths of despair. You brought your weird flour, your tragic hopes, and you waited for something vaguely edible to emerge. What came out was usually dense, blackened, and about as inviting as a brick with abandonment issues. But it was bread, sort of, as long as it didn't twitch. Some desperate souls tried to stretch their dough with things that weren't food. Clay chalk, ground bones, moss. The nutritional value was negligible, but it added that crunchy medieval texture everyone hated and feared. Children were the first to get sick, then the elderly, then the strong. Because famine doesn't discriminate, it just cues you up. Ironically, those with the worst bread fared slightly better. If your loaf was mostly bark and sorrow, it probably wasn't laced with poison, just splinters. People began looking for signs. If a neighbor started twitching mid-sentence or claimed the Virgin Mary told him to lick a turnip, you knew it was time to dump the bread and rethink dinner. In villages with priests, the line between sin and spoiled grain got blurry. Was it divine punishment or just bad baking? Either way, the bread you ate could fill you, sicken you, or kill you. Sometimes all three in one sitting. With the fields dead, the bread cursed, and the animals suspiciously absent, it was time to embrace the lifestyle of the forest gremlin. Welcome to Foraging Medieval Edition. No trendy baskets, No botanical guidebooks, just you, the woods, and a vague sense that this mushroom might be dinner or doom. Peasants knew their local landscape better than most modern GPS systems. Not out of hobby, but because they had to remember which plant made soup and which one made your mouth froth like an angry goose. Trial and error was the unofficial curriculum. Emphasis on error. Nettles were a popular option. Once boiled thoroughly and insulted into submission, they could be eaten without stinging you from the inside. Dandelion leaves, bitter but edible. Wild garlic, a luxury. It masked the scent of existential dread. Some folks turned to roots, bach, parsnips, and whatever they could pry from the dirt without alerting the local badgers. Mushrooms were trickier. One bite could either nourish you or send you on a vivid spiritual journey involving flaming goats and talking clouds. And there were no refunds. Berries, sure, if you want to play the annual game of is it poison or just very tart. A wrong guess meant your stomach staged a rebellion and your soul took a walk. Tree bark was also back on the menu again. Elm bark could be ground into flour-like powder. Pine needles made a kind of tea if you were into forest cosplay. Some even chewed on reeds and grass, which, let's be honest, is just sadness in plant form. Children were often sent to forage, not because they were good at it, but because they were small and could fit between thorn bushes. Also, if they didn't return, you knew not to eat whatever they picked. Local wise women, aka unofficial botanists with suspiciously good teeth, were in high demand. Their knowledge of don't-die herbs often kept entire villages going. Of course, they were later accused of witchcraft because people have never been good at gratitude. Foraging wasn't glamorous. It was scratching survival from the margins. Every meal felt like gambling with nature, and nature usually had better cards. If the forest didn't feed you and your bread, try to murder you. The next logical step was to turn to the greatest institution in medieval survival: community guilt and religious bargaining. Let's start with your neighbors. In normal times, you'd exchange gossip, maybe a chicken, maybe your cousin in marriage. In famine times, you traded anything. And I mean anything. A broken tool, a threadbare tunic, that weird goat-shaped rock you insist is lucky. If it bought you half a turnip, it was a win. The village turned into a bearing circus. I'll fix your roof if you give me soup. I'll watch your kids if you let me chew on that onion. Everything had value except money. Money was for lords. Peasants dealt in onions, favors, and subtle threats. But when even the neighbors ran dry, the next option was divine intervention. Enter the church. Medieval churches were often the best-fed buildings in town. They had tithes, grain stores, wine cellars, and a suspiciously plump abbot. While you were gnawing bark, the monastery still had salted fish and wine because God apparently liked fermented luxury. So peasants did what peasants do best. They groveled. You could pray, of course, but it helped if you also swept the floors, offered your last egg, or donated that one relic your uncle claimed was the real finger of St. Jerome. It wasn't. It was a chicken bone. But shoo, in return, you might get a bowl of soup, or if lucky, bread without hallucinations. The clergy knew famine made people pious, and nothing filled pews faster than empty stomachs. Wills were rewritten. People donated land to the church in exchange for blessings and maybe lunch. Some folks joined monastic life outright, because starvation is slightly less awful when there's porridge and chanting. But not all clergy were generous. Some just told you to fast and trust in divine mercy, which is a nice way of saying, good luck with that, peasant. Still, churches became unofficial aid stations. A sermon, a wafer, and a reminder that starving now meant feasting later in heaven. Hopefully. When the fields failed, the forest ran dry, and the church soup became increasingly hypothetical. Peasants were left with only one option. Walk. Just pick up and leave. Pack your kids, your goat, and that one pot that hadn't cracked from sorrow, and go find food somewhere, anywhere. Medieval peasants weren't known for wanderlust. Most people were born, married, and died within walking distance of the same dung heap. But famine rewrote the rules. Suddenly, that suspicious rumor from the next valley, I heard they still have oats in Dunnick, became a beacon of hope, or at least something better than chewing your belt again. So off they went. It wasn't glamorous. There were no caravans with upbeat music and matching cloaks, just gaunt families trudging down muddy paths, dodging wolves and local barons, and hoping to find a village that hadn't already eaten its cats. Some nobles tried to stop the wandering, not out of concern, but because empty fields meant no one was around to pay taxes or die in the next pointless skirmish. So vagrancy laws were introduced. Translation: you're not starving the correct way. Go home and do it properly. Others welcomed refugees, especially lords who had land, but no labor. If you had strong arms and didn't look too plaguey, you might score a spot in someone else's thief. The interview process was simple. Can you swing a scythe? Can you dig? Will you eat rats without complaining? Great. Welcome to the team. But moving was risky. You didn't know the customs, the dialect, or whether the local priest thought your accent was demonic. Many ended up in towns, which were like modern cities, except louder, filthier, and more on fire. At least there, begging was a viable career. Some gave up entirely and became outlaws, poachers, or roadside prophets, shouting about divine turnips and wheat miracles. Famine was a great equalizer. Everyone was equally desperate, equally filthy, and equally suspicious of that beef stew with no cows in sight. In the end, mobility was a last resort, a gamble. You either found a new life or just a different place to starve slightly more stylishly. By month 6 of a famine, the term food begins to lose meaning. You've already eaten the bread, the porridge, the goat, Arab lidi, and probably your pride. What's left is what historians politely call famine foods, and what medieval peasants probably called simply Tuesday. Let's start with tree bark. Again, it comes up a lot. People weren't munching on logs like beavers. They'd peel the inner layer called the cambium, dry it, grind it, and mix it with whatever passed for flour. The result, bark bread, which sounds like a hipster cafe special, but tastes like mulch wrapped in desperation. Then there were grass cakes. No, not the herbal kind your cousin smokes. Literal ground-up weeds, moss, or even straw mashed with water and dried in the sun. It had the texture of regret and the nutritional value of a sock. But hey, chewing something is better than chewing nothing. Leather. Fair game. Old boots, belts, harnesses, boiled long enough. They became chewy, salty, and mostly non-lethal. Medieval stew recipes didn't always clarify animal product. So, if it held a buckle at one point, into the pot it went. Cats, dogs, and rats. Let's just say famine wasn't a great time to be a household pet. Rats, in particular, became a delicacy. Easy to catch, easy to roast, and if you squinted hard enough, you could pretend it was chicken, or at least not rat. People also got creative with bones. You could boil them for hours to make broth. If you'd already boiled them last week, you boiled them again. Bone broth became bone tea, became bone sadness. Worst of all were the ergot-infected grains. They looked normal, rye or wheat, but carried a lovely hallucinogenic fungus. Symptoms included vomiting, gangrene, and sometimes dancing until you died. Not ideal, but hey, some villagers appreciated the entertainment. And then there were miracle foods. Roots that made you vomit, but not die. Lichens that vaguely resembled cheese. And if you were really lucky, a single surviving apple that hadn't fermented into an alcoholic wasp hotel. In short, the medieval menu during famine was an ever-shrinking roulette of will this kill me, with a side of probably. Famine wasn't just a bad time to eat. It was also a bad time to die, which unfortunately a lot of people did. Slowly, painfully, and often in a way that made others wonder. Do you mind if I take your boots? Medieval peasants had a complicated relationship with death. On the one hand, it was ever-present. On the other, famine made it especially clingy. But just because you were starving didn't mean you could afford a dramatic goodbye. There were no deathbed monologues, just a lot of coughing, groaning, and someone muttering, "Please don't die in the soup pot again." Burial customs had to adjust. Normally, you get a nice shroud, a few prayers, maybe some weeping during a famine. Efficiency was key. Communal graves became common. Not out of some noble, we're all in this together spirit, but because grave digging is exhausting and no one had calories to spare on solo funerals. Clerics tried to keep things holy. Last rites were rushed. Confessions were squeezed into 30-second slots. "Forgive me, Father, for I have just not if it was a lot. We're on a schedule." Children were especially vulnerable, which meant grieving parents had to keep pushing forward. In some regions, they named their next kid after the one that died last week. A kind of medieval cruel applause. Grim, yes. Practical also, yes, also. But death wasn't always met with despair. In the twisted logic of famine, a dead neighbor meant one less mouth to feed, and potentially a spare blanket. It sounds heartless, but after your fourth dinner of boiled clover and hallucinations, morality becomes more of a luxury. Some peasants even turn to dance macabre art. Cheerful little drawings of skeletons doing jigs. It wasn't just morbid fun. It was therapy. If death was coming anyway, might as well imagine him doing the worm. And then there were the true survivalists. Those who lingered. The skeletal peasants with the sunken eyes and the willpower of cockroaches. They'd seen 3 plagues, 2 lords, and 1 cow rebellion. Famine wouldn't be their end. Probably famine didn't just flatten fields. It reshuffled the medieval social pyramid like a drunken game of Jenga. And if you thought your local baron was stingy before the crops failed, just wait until he was rationing turnips like they were diamonds. First off, let's talk lords. You'd think a famine would humble the nobility. It didn't. In many cases, it made them more dramatic. Picture this. Your peasants are withering in the fields, and instead of lowering taxes or distributing grain, your local lord decides it's the perfect time to throw a banquet for himself with venison and music. Probably a juggler, too. Why? Because nothing says God's chosen ruler like flaunting your last pig in front of starving villagers. But it wasn't all feasting and fencing tournaments. Some lords genuinely try to help by offering arms, organizing grain imports, or at least not actively stealing your ox. These rare paragons were remembered fondly for about 5 minutes until the next tax collection. Then there were the clergy. Monasteries occasionally opened their stores, feeding the poor with old cheese and good intentions. But many also used famine as a marketing opportunity. Starving? That's probably your sin talking. Donate land to the church, and we'll pray extra hard for rain. Peasants didn't have many options. They could beg, barter, or join a revolt. Revolts were rarely successful, but they did provide great cardio and the occasional upgrade in scenery, usually the dungeon. Famine also created moral panic. Suddenly, anyone who wasn't starving enough was suspicious. Hoarding, witchcraft, secretly French. Who knows if your cheeks looked slightly too plump? People started eyeing you like a suspicious sausage. And let's not forget marriage markets. With life expectancy plummeting, families rushed to marry off their kids before they became collateral damage. Dowies were reduced to half a sack of oats and a moderately haunted spoon. But despite all the chaos, peasants still found moments of rebellion, secret foraging parties, shared meals of mystery stew, and the occasional sarcastic carving in a barn wall. Sir Geoffrey is a donkey. Let's face it, after 6 months of eating bark, burying your neighbors, and listening to your Lord preach about God's divine diet plan, your brain starts to unravel. Famine didn't just starve the stomach, it starved the soul. Medieval peasants, not known for their access to therapists or scented candles, had to get creative when it came to psychological survival. Some doubled down on faith, attending every mass, lighting every candle, and hoping that groveling louder would somehow convince the Almighty to cancel the drought. Others decided the famine was punishment for immorality, which conveniently always meant someone else's behavior. Usually women, foreigners, or that guy down the road who smiled too much. Superstitions flourished like mold on last month's cheese. People blamed witches for crop failure, or comets, or that weird cloud that looked like a fish. Folk rituals were revived, or invented on the spot. Want rain? Sacrifice a chicken? No chicken. Shout at the sky. Still no rain. Obviously, the problem is your neighbor not shouting hard enough. Dreams took a dark turn, too. When your diet is 90% grass and regret, your brain starts throwing weird curveballs at night. Peasants reported visions of saints, demons, or celestial cows promising milk that never came. Waking up was somehow worse than sleeping. Some peasants coped with gallows humor. You'd joke that your wife's stew could kill a man, only to discover it already had. Guess he couldn't handle the flavor, someone would say, and everyone would laugh a little too long. Children invented famine games. Count the ribs was not as fun as it sounds. Is that edible? Became a competitive sport, and hide and seek took on new urgency when debt collectors showed up. Even art reflected the mood. Marginalia in manuscripts featured dancing skeletons, vomiting peasants, or nuns, sword-fighting snails. No one's really sure what the snails meant, But let's just say subtlety was not the era's strong point. And yet, they endured because somehow, despite everything, humans have an annoying tendency to keep going. Even when their diet is moss soup and their bedtime story is the death toll. Famine isn't generally remembered as a time of innovation, unless you count how to boil moss in a soup as culinary progress. But as strange as it sounds, hardship sometimes forced medieval peasants to accidentally stumble into useful adaptations. Because when life gives you no lemons, you find out which weeds are technically edible. One of the most surprising effects of famine years, better composting. Yes, the same people who previously dumped waste near the nearest stream began realizing that maybe, just maybe, their fields grew slightly less pathetic when they stopped fertilizing them with despair and actual garbage. Some peasants began rotating crops more thoughtfully, even if they had no idea what nutrient depletion meant. They just knew that when they grew beans after barley, fewer people died. Good enough. Desperation also spurred a strange kind of biodiversity. Wild plants, overlooked berries, and forgotten grains made their way back into diets. What modern hipsters call ancient grains, medieval peasants called whatever that is. Eat it before it runs. Rye, millet, and spelt got a revival simply because wheat was acting like a diva and refusing to grow. Preservation methods improved, too. People began salting, drying, and smoking anything vaguely food-shaped, even things that probably shouldn't have been food. Medieval folks discovered that if you buried cheese long enough, it developed a rind and a personality. Was it edible? Depends on your standards. Was it inspiring? Absolutely. The scarcity of resources also encouraged shared labor. Communal ovens and collective farming weren't new ideas, but famine made them non-optional. If your neighbor had flour and you had firewood, congratulations. You now owned half a loaf of bread and a fragile alliance based on mutual chewing. Even architecture adapted. Granaries were better protected. Some villages even built raised storehouses to prevent moisture. And more importantly, rats. Those furry little famine side quests that no one asked for. And perhaps most importantly, famine made people talk. Oral knowledge. What plants help with stomach pain? Which fields drain best? And which mushrooms, killed only slightly, became precious? Passed from grandmother to daughter to anyone still standing. So imagine this. After a full year of chewing tree bark, whispering prayers to the cabbage gods, and boiling your belt for soup, something green starts pushing out of the dirt. Is it food? Real food? Like not cursed by a saint or nibbled by rats. For medieval peasants, the return of the harvest wasn't a celebration. It was more like cautiously dating an ex who swore they'd changed. You wanted to believe it. You hoped this time would be different. But also, you remembered last winter. First came disbelief. That barley's looking awfully confident, one peasant might say, side-eyeing a promising field like it owed him money. Then came superstition. Maybe it's a trick. Maybe it's a demonic barley. Should we burn it? Bless it? Sacrifice Jeff? Still, hunger eventually overruled suspicion. Once the harvest looked stable, everyone got to working fast. There was no medieval version of a harvest festival with wine, music, and hay rides. It was more like a high-stakes race against time, weather, and your neighbor who claimed that field was his. Actually, grain was gathered with the reverence of holy relics. People wept at the sight of actual loaves. Families that had been surviving on lichen and sarcasm finally shared meals with more than one ingredient. Children born during the famine tasted their first real bread and probably cried, either from joy or because it still had weevils in it. Medieval quality control was not rigorous, but trust didn't return easily. Many peasants continued hoarding. Old heels of bread were hidden in walls. Clay pots of dried peas were buried behind barns. One man reportedly kept a single onion wrapped in cloth under his bed for emergencies. Was it weird? Yes. Was it relatable? Also yes. Villages made plans. Some smarter lords even instituted grain reserves. Others simply raised taxes again, because obviously if peasants weren't starving, they must be hoarding coin. That's just science. Still, the return of food didn't just feed bodies. It fed hope. Babies were born less frail. Jokes got funnier, and peasant fashion, once defined entirely by potato sack, began to experiment with colors again, usually brown, but a hopeful brown. Once the famine was over, crops restored, rats politely diminished, and diets upgraded from questionable puddle to actual porridge. Medieval peasants did what humans always do after surviving an existential crisis. They talked about it endlessly. Every village had its famine storytellers. Old men at the tavern would slam their cups and begin, "Back in the bad year, I lived off boiled bark and my will to gossip." Someone else would counter, "That's nothing. My uncle sucked soup through a straw made of pig bone." By the time these tales reached the next generation, entire families had reportedly lived in trees, eaten their hats, or fought off wolves using only dry bread and poor manners. Grannies were the Olympic champions of famine exaggeration. "You kids have no idea," they'd say, stirring stew with the same spoon they'd once allegedly used to dig up roots during the winter of sorrow. "In my day, we didn't have stew. We had boiled hope, no seasoning." Even children got involved in play. They'd pretend to beg for turnips, argue over imaginary thistles, or collapse dramatically from pretend hunger. One could say it built character or trauma, a bit of both. But beneath the theatrical flair, there was real purpose. Famine stories were cautionary tales. They preserved hard-earned survival knowledge, which weeds weren't fatal, which mushrooms absolutely were, and which lord were more likely to steal your seed grain for the glory of the realm. These tales also strengthened community bonds. If you had suffered together, you laughed louder together, even if the jokes were mostly about flatulence, moldy bread, and Uncle Jeff's infamous thistle pie. It looked like a crime and tasted like punishment. Songs emerged, too. Dirges with catchy choruses about empty granaries, greedy landlords, and dreams of butter. Medieval peasants may have lacked recording equipment, but oral tradition ensured that no one forgot just how awful the famine had been or how funny it was. In retrospect, that Brother Thomas once tried to milk a goose. By the time the next famine rolled around, and it always did, people remembered, and they were just a little bit better prepared, or at least better at laughing through the misery. For every peasant who survived a famine by boiling questionable soup, or eating moss like it was a lifestyle choice, there were plenty who didn't. Famine didn't just empty plates, it emptied villages, and what followed was a grim dance between necessity, superstition, and the ever-popular medieval theme of this is the worst day of my life. When people began dying quietly at first, then in waves, the living faced a new problem: where to put all the bodies. Burial grounds filled up quickly. Some parishes ran out of consecrated land and had to improvise. Enter the infamous spoon story. No, not a metaphor. In some regions, grave diggers, too weak for proper tools, reportedly used wooden spoons to scrape shallow pits. Rest in peace became more like rest as best we can. Funeral customs adapted. Elaborate rites were replaced by hasty prayers, and if you were lucky, someone remembering your name. The village priest did his best, but after officiating his 17th funeral that week, even he started phoning it in. Well, not literally. This was medieval Europe. The only thing that rang was the death bell. Clothing already minimal became even more symbolic. Families tied black ribbons or wore ashes, not out of fashion, but because it was all they had left. Public mourning was brief, not because people were heartless, but because grief had to share space with hunger and planting barley. Still, there were moments of dignity. Makeshift memorials appeared, small wooden crosses, carvings on stones, or even just a ring hung from a branch. Stories were whispered, tales of courage, of last meals shared, of someone giving away their final crust of bread. Because if you couldn't save them, you could remember them. Children played funeral, not out of cruelty, but because it was now part of life. They'd line up dolls made from straw and act out burials with acorns and sticks. Creepy, maybe therapeutic, definitely. And when the famine passed, those who remained carried the weight of memory. Graves grew grass, but the names lingered. Peasants told stories not just of survival, but of those who didn't, ensuring that even in a world of mud and hardship, no one was completely forgotten. Surviving a famine wasn't just a physical ordeal. It rewired your entire sense of trust in nature, in your neighbors, and especially in your local lord, who spent the bad year eating roast pheasant while you gnawed on boiled rope. And when the hunger faded, something unexpected grew in its place. Resentment. Peasants, once humble and docile, mostly because their legs were too weak for rebellion, began to notice patterns. like how their overlord somehow always had food, or how the grain stores were empty for the poor, but miraculously full when the taxman showed up, and thus the whispering began. They starved us on purpose. My cousin saw the abbot with cheese. I heard the Lord's dog eats better than we do. That last one was probably true. In some regions, famine led to uprisings. Peasants didn't have swords, but they did have pitchforks, hoes, and the kind of rage only achievable after 3 consecutive dinners of dried nettles. Riots flared in market squares. Granaries were raided. Occasionally, a noble found himself locked in his own wine cellar by people who no longer thought divine right included stealing barley. Of course, most rebellions were swiftly and violently crushed. That's the thing about revolts. You can't outrun knights on a donkey. But the fear stuck. Lords began investing in sturdier locks, higher towers, and even guards for their grain stores. You know things are tense when you need armed protection for a sack of oats. Some monarchs, the ones with more brains than bloodlust, took a different route. They introduced grain regulation, emergency granaries, market controls, not because they care necessarily, but because starving peasants are quiet, angry, fed peasants are organized. Famine survival even reshaped law. A peasant caught stealing a loaf during the famine might once have lost a hand. Afterward, they might be forgiven. After all, everyone remembered that year when justice starved right alongside mercy. So, how did medieval peasants survive a famine year? Through desperation, ingenuity, blind luck, and when needed, the courage to challenge a system built on their hunger. And if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of those stories whispered over campfires, etched into church walls, or buried beneath centuries of dirt and dignity. On a cold December night in 1542, inside the stone walls of Linlithgow Palace, a baby girl entered the world already carrying the crushing weight of a crown. Mary Stuart, later known as Mary, Queen of Scots, was not born into the ordinary rhythms of infancy. She was born in a crisis. Just 6 days before, her father, King James V of Scotland, had fallen gravely ill after a military defeat at Sowe Moss. His last word was said to have been laced with despair. It came with alas, and it will go with alas, predicting that the Stuart dynasty, which had begun centuries earlier with a female heir, would also end with one. Whether he truly uttered these words or not, they clung to Mary's story like a curse. At only 6 days old, Mary became Queen of Scotland, a title that made her both precious and perilous. She was a child too young to know the meaning of power. Yet, she instantly became the centerpiece of a dangerous political game. The Scottish nobility, fierce and divided, jockeyed for influence, while England's King Henry VIII saw opportunity. He proposed a rough wooing, a brutal campaign meant to force a marriage alliance between infant Mary and his young son, Prince Edward. Scotland resisted, and in resisting, Mary's destiny was sealed as one intertwined with bloodshed and betrayal. Unlike most monarchs, she never experienced a childhood free of politics. Her cradle was guarded not by gentle lullabies, but by anxious whispers of treaties, alliances, and looming threats. Regents ruled in her name, but their loyalty was often as thin as parchment. Every decision, from where she would sleep to whom she might someday marry, carried international weight. Even in her infancy, Mary represented both hope and danger. To the Scots, she was a sovereign to rally around, a symbol of independence. To the English, she was a potential bride or a rival claimant to the English throne itself, thanks to her Tudor blood. To the French, she was a pawn to be protected and nurtured for future alliances. Thus, before she could walk or speak, Mary Stuart was already a queen, a bride in waiting, and a threat. Her life had begun not as a simple story of birth and growth, but as the opening act of a political drama that would span decades and end in tragedy. Mary's guardians knew from the start that Scotland was too dangerous a place for a child queen. English armies under Henry VIII threatened to seize her, pressing for marriage to his son Edward. Scotland, instead of surrendering its infant monarch, turned to its old ally across the Channel, France. At the age of 5, Mary was sent away, bundled onto a ship bound for the glittering courts of Europe. The voyage was perilous, but she arrived safely in France in 1548. a little girl carrying the weight of two kingdoms. In France, Mary found a world far removed from the raw feuds of the Scottish clans. The French court dazzled with silks, jewels, and elaborate ceremony. She was placed under the guardianship of King Henry II and his Queen Catherine de' Medici, and quickly became both cherished guest and valuable political asset. Her presence symbolized the enduring old alliance between France and Scotland, a union cemented further by her betrothal to the Dr. Francis, the king's delicate but beloved son. Unlike the isolation she might have faced in Scotland, Mary thrived in the French court. She was given an elite education alongside French princesses and noble children, including Catherine de' Medici's own daughters. Tutors schooled her in languages, music, poetry, and courtly manners. She learned to read and write in French and Latin, and her natural intelligence shone. Graceful, tall for her age, with auburn hair and striking features, Mary soon became the jewel of the Valois court. Yet even in this seemingly charmed childhood, her destiny was never her own. Every lesson in etiquette, every alliance sealed by a dance or a shared smile reinforced her future role as queen, not just of Scotland, but potentially of France. To the French, she was their future queen consort. To the Scots, she remained a distant sovereign. And to Elizabeth Tudor, the daughter of Henry VIII and now heir to the English throne, Mary was a looming problem, a rival with a claim that many Catholics considered stronger than her own. Still, for a brief time, Mary lived in a kind of golden cocoon. She laughed with her companions, composed poetry, and played music, unaware of how fleeting peace would be. The French court raised her not as a Scottish outsider, but as one of their own, a queen in waiting, destined to step onto the great stage of Europe. By the time Mary reached her teenage years, the girl who had been sent abroad for safety had blossomed into one of Europe's most admired princesses. Intelligent, eloquent, and unusually tall for a woman of her time, she stood out in the French court, not just for her striking appearance, but for her poise. Courtiers remarked that she seemed destined for greatness, and destiny, at least for a brief moment, seemed to smile on her. At just 15 years old, Mary married Francis, the Dauphin of France, in April 1558. The union was celebrated with all the grandeur France could muster. Tapestries unfurled, bells rang, and feasts stretched for days. To the French, Mary was now more than an honored guest. She was their future queen consort. To the Scots, the marriage meant powerful French backing against English aggression. And to England's Queen Elizabeth, who had ascended the throne just months before, it was a dangerous political development. Mary's claim to the English crown through her grandmother Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, was already strong. As the wife of the French heir, she now had the might of Catholic Europe behind her. The marriage itself, however, was not the romantic fairy tale the pageantry suggested. Francis was frail, sickly, and timid, a sharp contrast to Mary's vibrancy. While she dazzled with wit and confidence, he often seemed overwhelmed by his role. Still, Mary remained beautiful, patient, and loyal to him. She played her part as a devoted wife, supporting his fragile health and bolstering his image when he faltered. In 1559, fortune elevated her further. King Henry II of France died unexpectedly after a jousting accident, and Francis, barely 15, ascended the throne. Mary, now only 16, became queen consort of France. For a brief and glittering moment, she held a crown in each hand, Queen of Scotland by birth and Queen of France by marriage. Europe watched in awe and in fear, but the triumph was short-lived. Francis's health, always precarious, began to deteriorate rapidly. Within a year, he was dead at just 16, leaving Mary a widow before she had even turned 18. The glittering dream of ruling France collapsed overnight, and Mary was forced to face an uncertain future. Widowed before her 18th birthday, Mary found herself a queen without a kingdom she could directly control. In France, her position collapsed instantly after Francis's death in 1560. Catherine de' Medici, her formidable mother-in-law, had no interest in keeping the young widow at the heart of French politics. The court that had once adored Mary now turned cold, seeing her as a reminder of lost ambitions. With little choice, Mary prepared to return to Scotland, a land she had left as a child and now barely knew. Her return in 1561 was met with mixed emotions. The Scots welcomed their queen with curiosity, but they also viewed her as a foreigner, a woman who had grown up in luxury among the French nobility and who followed Catholic traditions in a kingdom that had recently embraced Protestant reform. Her arrival in Edinburgh was dramatic. The streets bustled with onlookers, musicians played, and bonfires lit the night. Yet beneath the spectacle lay unease. Mary was just 19, young and beautiful, but she faced a realm divided by religion and noble rivalries. John Knox, the fiery Protestant preacher, thundered against her Catholic faith, declaring that a woman and a papist that had no rightful place on the throne. Mary, however, met him with characteristic grace and intelligence, refusing to be cowed. She assured her subjects that she would not force Catholicism on them, a pragmatic stance that won her cautious support. Still, her task was formidable. She had to win the loyalty of a suspicious nobility, navigate the rising tide of Protestantism, and defend her crown against English interference. Elizabeth I of England watched Mary's every move. To Elizabeth, Mary was more than just a neighboring queen. She was a rival claimant whose legitimacy was championed by Catholics across Europe. In Scotland, Mary sought to rule with tolerance and diplomacy. She surrounded herself with trusted advisors, worked to stabilize finances, and attempted to reconcile the clashing factions that threatened to tear the country apart. But tensions ran deep, and every decision she made, from her faith to her friendships, was scrutinized for signs of weakness. Mary had returned to claim her place as Scotland's sovereign, but the kingdom she inherited was one of unrest, suspicion, and fragile loyalty. The stage was set for the turbulent years that would define her reign. As queen, Mary knew that marriage was not just a personal choice, but a political weapon. Every suitor represented an alliance, a gamble, and a potential threat. For years, she resisted pressure, carefully weighing her options. But in 1565, she made a bold and ultimately disastrous decision. She married Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. Darnley was tall, handsome, and like Mary, descended from the Tudor line, which strengthened her claim to the English throne. On paper, the match seemed ideal. Their union joined two powerful branches of the Stuart family, producing heirs who could unite both Scotland and England under Catholic legitimacy. Mary was smitten at first, captivated by his charm and youthful vigor. The people, however, were less convinced. Nobles worried about Darnley's arrogance, while Elizabeth I seethed at the threat of their combined claim. At first, the marriage brought Mary joy and a sense of renewed purpose. But the mask soon slipped. Darnley revealed himself to be vain, immature, and deeply ambitious. He expected to be named king outright, not merely consort, and resented Mary's authority. His drunken outbursts and reckless behavior alienated the nobles who began to despise him. Even Mary, who had once defended him passionately, grew disillusioned. The breaking point came with the infamous murder of David Rizzio, Mary's private secretary and close confidant. Darnley, consumed by jealousy and egged on by rebellious lords, believed Rizzio had grown too close to his wife. In March 1566, during a supper at Holyrood Palace, armed conspirators burst into the Queen's chamber. In front of the pregnant Mary, they dragged Rizzio away and stabbed him more than 50 times. The Queen, terrified and humiliated, was powerless to intervene. Though Darnley had betrayed her trust, Mary kept her composure. She gave birth to a son, James, in June 1566, a child destined to inherit both the Scottish and English thrones. But her marriage to Darnley was broken beyond repair. His reputation sank further, and even his allies abandoned him. When Darnley was found dead under suspicious circumstances in 1567, strangled after a mysterious explosion at Kirkhofield, suspicion fell directly on Mary. Whether she played a role remains debated, but the stain of scandal would haunt her forever. What had begun as a marriage of promise ended in blood, betrayal, and a dangerous shadow over her reign. The death of Lord Darnley left Scotland reeling. Though many despised him, the violent and suspicious circumstances of his murder demanded justice. Instead of clarity, the investigation only deepened the scandal. Whispers quickly spread that James Byrne, Earl of Bothwell, one of Mary's closest allies, was involved. And when Mary herself was soon linked to Bothwell, gossip curdled into open accusation. Bothwell was everything Darnley was not: bold, ruthless, and commanding. He had long been a powerful figure in Scottish politics, and unlike the indecisive nobles who wavered in loyalty, he seemed unwavering in his support for Mary. To some, he was the strong protector she needed. To others, he was a dangerous opportunist. In April 1567, Bothwell was put on trial for Darnley's murder. But the proceedings were a farce. The trial was rushed, witnesses were intimidated, and Bothwell was acquitted. Within weeks, he shocked the kingdom by marrying Mary. Whether she went willingly or was coerced remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Some accounts suggest both abducted her and forced the union. Others argue Mary, isolated and desperate for strength, chose him out of her own resolve. Either way, the marriage was catastrophic for her reputation. The nobles, already wary of Mary after Darnley's death, rose in rebellion. To them, her marriage to the man widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's murder was proof of complicity. The scandal gave her enemies all they needed. Within months, civil war erupted. At Carberry Hill, Mary's forces faced the lords who demanded her abdication. Deserted by many of her supporters, she surrendered while Bothwell fled into exile. Mary's fall from grace was swift and brutal. The once beloved young queen who had charmed France and Scotland was now branded a scandalous widow turned reckless bride. In the eyes of her enemies, she had traded dignity for desire, crown for disgrace. Her marriage to Bothwell, whether born of love, fear, or strategy, became the turning point of her reign. The choice that tipped Scotland into chaos and set her on a path from which there was no return. She was imprisoned at Loch Leven Castle, her crown stripped from her head. Her infant son, James, was declared King of Scotland, and Mary was left to contemplate the ruins of her life. Mary's imprisonment at Leven Castle seemed to seal her fate. She was forced to abdicate in 1567, handing the crown to her infant son, James, while her half-brother, the Earl of Moore, ruled as regent. Stripped of power and betrayed by many nobles who had once sworn loyalty, Mary appeared finished. Yet she was never one to surrender quietly. In May 1568, with the help of loyal supporters, she disguised herself and fled the castle in a daring escape. The queen was free again, ready to rally her followers. For a brief moment, fortune tilted in her favor. Supporters gathered around her, and she raised an army to reclaim her throne. But at the Battle of Langside, her forces were decisively defeated. Exhausted and desperate, Mary made a fateful decision. Instead of fleeing to France, where she had once reigned as queen consort, she crossed the border into England, seeking refuge with her cousin Elizabeth I. It was a choice that would doom her. Elizabeth faced an impossible dilemma. On the one hand, Mary was her blood relative, a fellow queen, and a woman who had endured misfortune. On the other hand, Mary was also a Catholic with a strong hereditary claim to the English throne, one that many in Europe considered more legitimate than Elizabeth's. To shelter Mary was to invite rebellion. To reject her was to betray royal kinship. In the end, Elizabeth chose caution. Mary was taken into protective custody, though it quickly became clear that protection was little more than house arrest. She would never be free again. Shuffled from one grand manor to another, she lived under constant watch, her movements restricted, her letters monitored. At first, Mary clung to hope. She wrote to European rulers, appealed to Catholic allies, and plotted ways to regain her throne. She imagined Elizabeth would eventually meet her face to face, queen to queen, and grant her justice. But that meeting never came. Instead, Mary became a prisoner of politics, a living threat whom Elizabeth dared not release. Thus began Mary's 19 years of captivity in England. She was no longer the radiant young queen who had once held two crowns, but a captive figure at the center of Europe's religious and dynastic struggles. Admired by some, hated by others, and feared most of all by Elizabeth herself. Mary's captivity in England was unlike a dungeon sentence. She was held in great houses and castles, Sheffield, Tutbury, Chartley, places of comfort compared to a prison cell, yet gilded cages all the same. Servants attended her. She embroidered, hunted, and wrote letters. But every step she took was monitored. She had lost her freedom, not her dignity, and certainly not her ambition. To Catholic Europe, Mary remained a beacon of hope. Elizabeth I was a Protestant queen whose legitimacy was questioned by many. Mary, in contrast, was a Catholic with royalty to blood. For the Pope, Spain, and France, Mary was a potential rallying point for restoring Catholicism in England. This meant that as long as she lived, conspiracies would circle her like vultures. At first, Elizabeth tolerated her cousin's presence, hoping perhaps that time would dissolve her threat, but plots kept surfacing. The Rolfe plot in 1571 envisioned deposing Elizabeth and placing Mary on the throne with Spanish backing. The Throckmorton plot in 1583 again tied her name to Catholic uprisings. Each time the English crown grew more suspicious, but Elizabeth hesitated to condemn a fellow queen outright. Mary, meanwhile, grew restless and desperate. Cut off from power, she turned to secret correspondence, using coded letters smuggled in beer barrels and hidden within cloth. She saw herself not as a prisoner, but as a rightful sovereign, betrayed by fate and by her cousin. She dreamed of freedom, of reclaiming her throne in Scotland, or even of ruling England in Elizabeth's place. The breaking point came with the Babington Plot of 1586. Named after Anthony Babington, a young Catholic nobleman, the conspiracy aimed to assassinate Elizabeth and set Mary on the throne. Unbeknownst to Mary, Elizabeth's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had intercepted the letters. Her secret replies, written in cipher but now exposed, seemed to show her approval of the plan. Whether she fully endorsed Elizabeth's murder or merely longed for release remains debated, but to her enemies the evidence was damning. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had resisted calls to eliminate her cousin. Now the tide had turned. Parliament pressed for Mary's execution, insisting she would remain a danger as long as she breathed. The queen who had once commanded courts in both France and Scotland was now reduced to a pawn, one move away from checkmate. In the autumn of 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, was placed on trial at Fotheringhay Castle. After 19 long years of confinement, the daughter of Scotland now faced her final reckoning. She was charged with treason for her part in the Babington Plot, accused of conspiring to assassinate Elizabeth and seize the English throne. The trial was more spectacle than justice. Mary, a foreign-born queen, argued that she could not be guilty of treason against a monarch to whom she had never sworn allegiance. But the court was not inclined to sympathy. The intercepted letters were damning, and Elizabeth's ministers pressed their advantage. Mary defended herself with remarkable courage. Though weakened by years of captivity, she summoned the dignity of her crown. She reminded her accusers that she was a sovereign, not a subject, and that her fate had been shaped as much by political necessity as by personal ambition. Look to your consciences and remember that the theater of the whole world is wider than the kingdom of England, she declared, appealing not just to the judges before her, but to history itself. The verdict was never in doubt. Mary was found guilty and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated, torn between kinship and necessity. To execute a queen set a dangerous precedent. What if her own subjects took it as permission to rise against her? Yet keeping Mary alive meant endless plots, endless danger. At last, with great reluctance, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. On February 8th, 1587, Mary was led to the execution chamber at Fotheringhay. Dressed in black, she appeared every inch the queen, composed and serene. Beneath her gown, she wore crimson, the color of martyrdom. Kneeling before the block, she prayed for her son James and forgave her executioners. The first axe stroke was clumsy, the second more decisive, and with the third, the life of Mary, Queen of Scots, was ended. She was 44 years old. Her death sent shock waves through Europe. To Catholics, she was a martyr. To Protestants, a cautionary tale. Her son, James VI of Scotland, would one day inherit Elizabeth's throne as James I of England, uniting the crown she had so desperately sought to join. Mary's life was a tapestry woven with love, betrayal, and ambition. Crowned as an infant, imprisoned for half her years, and executed as a traitor, she left behind a legacy as one of history's most tragic and captivating queens. In the Middle Ages, the Scottish diet was defined less by choice than by necessity, and no food symbolized that reality better than the oat. Hearty, dependable, and unpretentious, oats were the grain that thrived where wheat and barley often failed. The Scottish climate, with its cold winds, short summers, and frequent rains, did not lend itself to golden fields of wheat like those in England or France. Instead, it was the modest oat that grew strong in poor soils, stubbornly surviving where other crops withered. This resilience made it the cornerstone of Scottish sustenance. Every household from peasant crafters to minor LEDs relied on oats as their daily bread. Quite literally, oats were ground into meal on simple custstones, passed from mother to daughter as a staple of the home. Once ground, the meal could be stored for months, making it as valuable in the depths of winter as in the height of summer. Families stirred it into thick porridge, pressed it into oat cakes, or boiled it into broths that stretched meager supplies of meat and vegetables. Without oats, most Scots would not have survived the leanest years. The oats' role was not glamorous, but it was vital. In a society where hunting rights were often restricted and imported, luxuries were scarce. Oats were democratic, the food of everyone, from shepherds on the hillsides to monks in monasteries. They were the grain of endurance, eaten plain during hard times and flavored with honey, butter, or herbs when fortune allowed. Oats provided not only calories, but also a sense of stability in a world that was often uncertain. Travelers crossing the highlands carried sacks of oat cakes, hard and dry, but filling, tucked into packs for long marches. Soldiers, too, depended on them, knowing that in the field, a band made from oatmeal and water could keep them alive when supplies ran low. The grain became tied to identity itself, marking Scots as practical, hardy people shaped by their land and its limitations. To the medieval Scot, oats weren't just a crop. They were the foundation of survival, a daily reminder that strength lay not in luxury, but in endurance. Without oats, there would have been no bread, no porridge, and no broth. In every sense, this humble grain was the backbone of life. If porridge was the daily fuel of medieval Scotland, bannocks were its soul. These flat, round oat cakes were as common as the hearth itself, cooked on griddles known as girdles, or even directly on heated stones beside the fire. The ingredients were simple: oatmeal, water, and sometimes a pinch of salt. Yet from this humble mixture came one of the most versatile and beloved foods of the Middle Ages. The beauty of the ban was its adaptability. A poor cofter's bannock might be nothing more than oats and water quickly baked to provide sustenance after a long day in the fields. By contrast, a wealthier household could enrich theirs with butter, milk, or eggs, transforming it into something softer, richer, and more filling. Herbs, onions, or even dried fruits were sometimes added when available, making the ban not just a meal, but a small luxury. Cooking was straightforward, but deeply tied to tradition. Women of the household who oversaw most of the daily preparation would spread the dough thin and place it onto a hot girdle suspended over the open hearth. The smell of toasted oats filled the home, mingling with wood smoke, becoming a sensory anchor of family life. Bannocks were eaten fresh when possible, but they also kept well, especially when dried, making them practical provisions for journeys. Travelers and soldiers alike tucked them into packs, knowing these sturdy oat cakes could survive damp weather and hard conditions. Bannock also carried ceremonial weight. They were not just food, but markers of time and tradition. Special bannock were baked for festivals and seasonal rituals. Beltane bannocks at the start of summer, Lammas bannocks for the harvest, and Yule bannocks during winter festivities. In these moments, a simple oat cake became something more, a symbol of community, continuity, and survival through the seasons. What made the ban remarkable was not extravagance, but reliability. It was filling, transportable, and endlessly adaptable to circumstance. It sustained laborers in the fields, shepherds in the hills, monks in monasteries, and warriors preparing for battle. Though outsiders sometimes mocked the Scottish reliance on oats, for those who lived among the heather and rain, bannocks were proof of resilience, food that was simple, sustaining, and utterly their own. If the ban anchored the hearth, Porridge was the heartbeat of the medieval Scottish diet. Day after day, pot after pot, porridge simmered at the center of family life. Made with nothing more than oatmeal, water, and sometimes a splash of milk, it was a dish both ordinary and essential. The very definition of sustenance in a land where survival often meant making much from very little. Preparation was simple, yet ritualistic. A heavy iron pot would hang above the fire, and oatmeal would be stirred slowly into the boiling liquid with a wooden stick known as a spurtle. The stirring had its own rhythm passed down through generations with the goal of preventing clumps and keeping the porridge smooth. There was no rush. Porridge demanded patience, as steady stirring ensured a texture hearty enough to fill stomachs, but soft enough to eat quickly before heading to the fields. For many, porridge was breakfast, dinner, and sometimes supper too. In poorer households, a single pot might be stretched across an entire day, reheated with more water or broth added to make it last. In wealthier homes or monasteries, porridge could be enriched with milk, honey, or butter, turning the humble dish into something closer to comfort food. Leftover porridge was even poured into a drawer or tray, cooled into a solid mass, and sliced into portions, porridge cakes, that could be fried or eaten cold the next day. Beyond filling bellies, porridge was democratic. It nourished peasants, nobles, monks, and soldiers alike, binding together every rank of society with the same steaming bowl. In times of scarcity, it was often the only meal available, sustaining whole families through brutal winters when little else could be found. For children, it was often their first taste of solid food. For the elderly, their last comfort. Though plain to outsiders, porridge carried identity. English travelers mocked Scots for eating nothing but oats, but the Scots wore this as a badge of honor. Where others might starve, they endured thanks to the resilience of oats and the simplicity of porridge. Each spoonful was proof that strength came not from extravagance, but from perseverance. Porridge was more than food. It was survival, community, and culture simmered together in a single pot. Every morning in medieval Scotland, as the spurtle stirred, life itself was renewed. If porridge was the daily rhythm, broth was the melody that gave variety to the Scottish table. In the Middle Ages, broth wasn't simply a dish. It was a way of stretching whatever ingredients a household had on hand, transforming scraps and humble vegetables into something filling, warm, and sustaining. At its heart was oatmeal, once again, used not as the star, but as the quiet thickener that turned a thin soup into a meal. The base of most broths was kale, leeks, onions, or whatever greens could be grown in small plots or foraged nearby. Into this went salted meats when available, a strip of bacon, a piece of ham bone, or salted herring cut into chunks. Venison sometimes made its way into the pot, too, but that was more common in households with access to hunting rights. For peasants, meat was rare and precious, often appearing only on feast days or through barter. For them, the broth was mainly vegetables, oats, and herbs like parsley or thyme, with the occasional surprise of marrow or fat for flavor. Cooking broth was a communal act. A large cauldron would hang over the fire, and into it went whatever could be spared. Families ate from the same pot, dipping ladles or chunks of banana directly into the steaming liquid. Broth was not only filling, but also practical. It could simmer for hours, even days, with fresh ingredients added whenever possible. This constant perpetual stew was especially valuable during harsh winters when food supplies had to be stretched to their absolute limits. Broth also carried medicinal weight in the minds of medieval Scots. Hot, hearty liquid was thought to strengthen the weak, revive the sick, and warm the weary after long hours in the fields. Monks prescribed it to patients in infirmaries, while mothers relied on it to nourish children during illness. In a society where medicine was rudimentary and winters were cruel, a pot of broth was both comfort and cure. Though modest, broth was adaptable to fortune. For nobles, it might be flavored with game, spiced with imported pepper, or enriched with butter. For peasants, it was often just kale, oats, and salted water. Yet in both forms, it reflected the same truth. Survival in Scotland depended on making the most of what the land and sea offered. In every smoky hall and cofter's hut, broth filled bellies, bound families, and reminded all who ate it that life could be sustained with little more than patience. Oats, and a simmering fire. While oats, bread, and broth kept the hearth warm, the sea provided Scotland with another lifeline: fish. In the Middle Ages, salted herring became one of the most important staples, feeding villages, monasteries, and even armies. With miles of rugged coastline and countless lochs and rivers, fish were abundant. But it was preservation, the salting, smoking, and drying that turned herring into the backbone of Scotland's trade and diet. Fresh herring was eaten when possible, grilled over open flames, or boiled in broth. But most of the catch was salted, packed into barrels, and stored for leaner months. This simple preservation technique ensured that fish could travel inland to regions far from the coast, reaching Highland cofters who otherwise had little access to fresh catches. For many, salted herring was the most reliable source of protein they could afford. The church's influence also shaped its popularity, with strict fasting rules that forbade meat on Fridays. During Lent, and on other holy days, fish became the obvious substitute. Herring, cheap and plentiful, filled this religious gap perfectly. Monasteries consumed it in great quantities, often with oats or kale broth to bulk up the meal. For peasants, salted herring dipped in a porridge or paired with bannanacs was a common sight on the table, especially in winter. Fishing also tied Scotland into a wider medieval economy. The North Sea was a hub of trade, and Scottish ports bustled with merchants exchanging salted herring for wine, cloth, and spices from the continent. Herring barrels became as valuable as coin, sustaining both local diets and international commerce. But for ordinary families, the meaning of herring was far more practical. It was the taste of survival, a sharp, salty contrast to the blandness of porridge and bread. It gave variety when diets risked monotony, and it delivered strength for laborers who needed protein to endure long days in the fields or at sea. Children grew up gnawing on salted fish. Travelers carried it wrapped in cloth. Soldiers marched with it as part of their rations. In short, herring was not a delicacy, but a lifeline, the sea's enduring gift to a land where the soil was stingy. Alongside oats, it formed the dual pillars of the medieval Scottish diet: grain from the earth, fish from the waters, together sustaining a people shaped by both land and sea. Chapter 6. The green strength of kale. If oats were the backbone and herring the protein, then kale was the green muscle that held the Scottish diet together. In the Middle Ages, kale wasn't just a vegetable. It was a cornerstone of survival. Hardy and frost-resistant, kale thrived where other crops failed, making it one of the most reliable sources of nourishment in a cold and often unforgiving climate. Every coft and cottage had its kale patch, often protected by simple stone walls to keep out animals. These kale yards became so central to Scottish life that the very word kale came to mean food in general. Kale was versatile and above all dependable. It could be harvested year-round, even in the depths of winter when most other plants withered. Families cut the dark leaves and tossed them straight into bubbling pots of broth mixed with oats for thickening or served alongside bannocks as a simple side dish. It wasn't delicate fare, but it was rich in nutrients, vitamins, and iron that kept peasants strong through long winters of hard labor. The preparation of kale varied depending on what else was available. In poorer households, it was often boiled with nothing but water and oatmeal, creating a thin but sustaining kale broth. When meat or bones could be spared, the leaves absorbed the flavor, transforming into something heartier. Wealthier tables might dress kale with butter or cream, but for most, simplicity was the rule. The green leaf's role was to fill bellies, not impress guests. Kale also carried cultural weight. The callard was not just a garden. It was the heart of the household, the daily provider that ensured survival. The phrase callard literature would later be coined in Scotland to evoke homely rural life, a testament to how deeply kale was woven into identity. In medieval times, it symbolized endurance, the crop that never failed, the green that kept people alive when oats alone could not. Children grew up on kale broth. The elderly relied on it when teeth and strength gave way, and workers drank it down before heading into the fields. Like oats, kale was mocked by outsiders for its plainness. Yet for Scots, it was the quiet hero of their diet. Together with porridge and salted herring, it completed the holy trinity of survival foods, proof that sustenance came not from extravagance, but from resilience. For most medieval Scots, meat was a luxury, not a staple. Daily sustenance came from oats, kale, and broth, while salted herring or the occasional egg supplied protein. But when meat did appear on the table, it carried both prestige and celebration. Among all meats, venison stood apart. It was the food of lords, hunters, and festivals, rare, coveted, and symbolic of power. Venison was not freely available to everyone. In Scotland, as in much of medieval Europe, hunting rights were tightly controlled. Forests and deer parks belonged to nobles, and common folk risked severe punishment if caught poaching. This meant that for peasants, the chance to taste venison was exceptional, perhaps during a feast provided by a lair, or when scraps trickled down from noble kitchens. For most, the closest they came to deer was hearing hunting horns echo through the glens. For the nobility, however, venison was a mark of status. Great hunting parties were both sport and spectacle, with trained hounds and archers bringing down stags and dees. The kill was celebrated, the meat shared in banquets where roasted venison took pride of place. Richly seasoned with imported pepper, cloves, or cinnamon, luxuries brought through trade, venison was transformed into pies, roasts, and stews that contrasted sharply with the simple oat and kale fare of the peasantry. Still, even among the wealthy, venison was more than indulgence. It was tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Autumn hunts not only provided meat for immediate feasting, but also allowed carcasses to be salted or smoked for winter storage. Venison preserved in this way became part of larders that sustained castles and abbeys through the dark months when fresh food was scarce. The symbolic power of venison also resonated in the culture of the time. Deer were seen as noble animals, swift and elusive, their pursuit echoing ideals of bravery and skill. To eat venison was to partake in that nobility, reinforcing the hierarchy between those who could hunt and those who could only dream of it. For medieval Scotland, venison was never the daily bread. It was the taste of rarity, a fleeting encounter with richness in a life otherwise marked by simplicity. When it graced the table, whether in a lord's hall or trickled down to a humble hearth, it reminded all who ate it of the deep divide between feast and famine, privilege and survival. Food in medieval Scotland wasn't just about survival. It was also about faith. The rhythms of the church shaped when, what, and how people ate. With the Catholic calendar governing nearly every aspect of life, fasting and feast days created a cycle that alternated between restriction and indulgence, scarcity and celebration. Fasting was strict and frequent. On Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous holy days throughout the year, meat was forbidden. For the average Scot, this was less of a burden than it might sound. Meat was rare for peasants, even on ordinary days. But during fasting, the diet narrowed further. Fish, especially salted herring, became the default substitute alongside oats, kale, and simple broth. Monasteries and churches enforced these rules rigorously, ensuring that even nobles had to observe them, though wealthier households still found creative ways to make fasting fare more palatable with imported spices or rich sources. Feast days, however, turned the tables entirely. Religious festivals like Easter, Christmas, or local saints' days became opportunities for abundance. Nobles hosted lavish banquets where venison, beef, mutton, and pork were roasted and served with flags of ale and wine. Minstrels played, torches burned, and platters overflowed. For peasants, feast days were a welcome respite from monotony, offering communal meals where extra bannocks were baked, broth thickened with more meat than usual, and ale flowed more freely. These celebrations provided not just nourishment, but joy, a reminder that life was more than toil and survival. Even in smaller households, feast days were marked with symbolic foods. Special bannocks or oat cakes were baked for Beltane and Lammas, while Yule might see broth enriched with what little meat could be spared. These traditions gave ordinary people a sense of participation in the sacred calendar, binding their diet to the passage of time and the turning of the seasons. The balance between fasting and feasting also reinforced social hierarchy. Nobles demonstrated wealth with extravagant spreads, while peasants celebrated with what modest abundance they could manage. Yet both shared in the same rhythm, abstaining together, rejoicing together, and tying food to faith in a way that gave meaning to the most basic act of eating. In medieval Scotland, oats and fish might keep one alive, but feast days and fasting gave food its spiritual and cultural weight. The table was not only a place of nourishment, but also a reflection of devotion, discipline, and community. The medieval Scottish diet was rarely abundant, but it was remarkably resilient. Built on oats, kale, broths, and salted fish, it reflected a people shaped by their land. A rugged country where the soil was poor, the weather harsh, and survival demanded practicality over extravagance. Yet out of this simplicity came traditions that endured for centuries, forming a cultural identity tied as much to the hearth as to the battlefield. What made the Scottish table unique was its reliance on foods that outsiders often mocked. English travelers sneered at Scots for eating nothing but oats, while continental observers found their fare plain compared to French banquets or Italian feasts. But such criticism missed the point. Oats, kale, and herring weren't marks of poverty. They were emblems of resourcefulness. They allowed ordinary people to withstand winters that might have broken less hardy communities. They made Scotland self-sufficient, rooted in what the land and sea could reliably provide. This diet also carried a democratic spirit. While nobles enjoyed venison, spiced roasts, and imported luxuries on feast days, they too relied on oats and broth in their daily lives. Soldiers marching into battle, monks in their cloisters, cofters tending sheep, and children in smoky cottages all shared the same staple foods. Few things bound medieval Scotland together as powerfully as the taste of porridge in the morning or a bowl of kale broth at night. Even the rituals around food carried forward. Bannocks, once cooked on hot stones by the fire, continued to appear at seasonal festivals long after the Middle Ages. The calliard, that small patch of greens by every cottage, became a symbol of homely tradition, and the rhythms of fasting and feasting dictated by the church left echoes in later folk customs and celebrations. Perhaps the greatest legacy of this simple diet was endurance. Scots did not eat to impress. They ate to live, and in doing so created a cuisine that was plain but sustaining, modest but deeply tied to their identity. Even today, porridge, oat cakes, and hearty broths are remembered not only as foods, but as cultural touchstones, reminders of ancestors who survived with little more than patience, ingenuity, and the humble oat. The medieval Scottish table may not have glittered with extravagance, but it stood as a testament to resilience, a quiet strength nourished by bannocks, broth, and the green strength of kale. By the summer of 1099, the warriors of the First Crusade were ghosts of the great host that had left Europe 3 years earlier. They had set out under the banner of Christ, called by Pope Urban II to reclaim the Holy Land. Some had been driven by faith, others by hunger for land, wealth, or absolution of sins. But whatever their reasons, the march across continents had burned away illusions. Those who remained were scarred by hardship, whittled down from nearly 60,000 crusaders to perhaps 12,000 fighters. Their journey had been a crucible. Crossing Anatolia, they endured blistering heat, ambushes from Seljuk horsemen, and crippling shortages of food and water. At Antioch in 1098, they had faced one of the most harrowing sieges of the Middle Ages, starving in filth and gnawing on leather scraps while corpses piled high. Many deserted, others perished from hunger or plague. Yet when the city finally fell, it only steeled the survivors. They believed themselves chosen instruments of God, preserved against all odds for the final act. By the time they reached Palestine, the Crusaders were half army, half pilgrimage. Barefoot clerics marched alongside armored knights, chanting hymns as they crossed parched valleys. Peasants carried relics of saints to inspire courage. Horses were few, their strength spent, while men staggered beneath rusting mail. Yet they pressed onward, driven not only by religious fervor, but by the promise that every hardship would be redeemed upon reaching Jerusalem to the men of Europe. Jerusalem was not just a city. It was the heart of Christendom, the site of the crucifixion and resurrection, the place where heaven touched earth. Preachers had told them that to glimpse its walls would be to step closer to salvation itself. And so when at last the holy city appeared on the horizon in June 1099, the army collapsed to their knees, weeping, praying, and singing theme. They had come to the end of the world and the beginning of their greatest trial. But Jerusalem was not theirs to claim so easily. Behind its mighty walls stood defenders of the Fatimid Caliphate, ready to resist. The Crusaders, weary yet burning with zeal, prepared for the final siege that would decide the fate of the city and echo through centuries of history. When the Crusaders first laid eyes on Jerusalem in June 1099, or quickly gave way to dread, the Holy City was not some vulnerable outpost, but a fortress of faith and stone. Its thick walls rose high above rocky ground, punctuated by towers and defended gates. From the Mount of Olives, the Crusaders could see the golden dome of the rock gleaming in the sun, a sight that filled them with both longing and grim resolve. Inside, perhaps 30,000 people braced for what was to come. Jerusalem was under the control of the Fatimid Caliphate, who had wrested it from the Seljuk Turks only the year before. Its governor, Ifdayr, was experienced and ruthless, and he wasted no time preparing the defense. Stores of grain and water were secured, cistern filled, and the gates barred. Jews, Muslims, and Eastern Christians alike took shelter, aware that the storm outside their walls was no ordinary army, but a host of warriors convinced that God himself demanded their victory. The Crusaders, however, were not in ideal condition to launch a siege. They had marched across deserts, their supplies were low, and their horses nearly gone. Many of the knights dismounted, fighting as infantry alongside peasants, pilgrims, and priests. Food was scarce. Water had to be carried from distant springs, forcing men to march miles under scorching heat just for a sip. Hunger gnawed at them, and the stench of death from earlier battles clung to their ragged camp. Yet their desperation only sharpened their determination. Lacking proper siege engines, the Crusaders at first tried to assault the walls with ladders, stones, and whatever tools they could scavenge. Arrows rained down from above. Scorching oil was poured onto their heads, and defenders jeered as wave after wave broke against the ramparts. The Crusaders realized quickly that brute force alone would not breach Jerusalem. They needed towers, rams, and discipline, and for that, they needed time. Still, spirits were sustained by faith. Clergy led processions around the city walls, barefoot, chanting psalms, carrying relics, and calling on heaven to bless their struggle. To the defenders, it looked like madness. To the besiegers, it was proof that victory was already written. The siege of Jerusalem had begun, a contest of endurance, belief, and blood. For the Crusaders, there would be no turning back. The city before them was the prize of a lifetime, and they would either capture it or die at its gates. The early days of the siege made one thing brutally clear. Jerusalem's walls could not be taken by ladders and blind courage alone. The Crusaders needed siege engines, massive towers, rams, and catapults. But they had arrived at the holy city nearly empty-handed. Their army was exhausted, their supplies dwindling, and wood, the lifeblood of siegecraft, was scarce in the rocky hills surrounding Jerusalem. Desperation set in quickly. Food rations shrank to almost nothing. Bread became a memory. Men survived on roots, herbs, and whatever scraps they could find. Water was worse. Springs lay far from the camp, and the defenders poisoned some of them or ambushed supply runs. Men fainted from thirst under the relentless sun, while animals dropped dead in the dust. Horses, once the pride of knightly cavalry, were slaughtered for meat, their bones left to bleach outside the camp. Disease crept among the hungry ranks, and yet morale somehow held. They had come too far to turn back. The leaders of the crusade, Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Tancred, and others, rallied their forces with fiery speeches. Preachers reminded the men that Jerusalem was not just any city, but the very place where Christ had died and risen. To abandon the siege was to abandon salvation itself. That conviction gave the starving warriors a strength beyond flesh. Providence or luck soon delivered what they needed. Scouts located groves of trees near Samaria, and caravans brought timber back under guard. Skilled carpenters among the Crusaders, many of them artisans and laborers who had joined the pilgrimage, set to work. Under the blazing heat, hammers rang and saws cut as crude siege engines began to take shape. Wooden towers rose plank by plank, their frames lashed together with rope and rawhide. Battering rams were fashioned from felled trees, their heads bound with iron scavenged from pots, tools, even weapons. The defenders mocked them from walls, hurling insults alongside arrows and stones. Yet slowly, inevitably, the Crusaders transformed their desperate camp into a siege workshop. Each new tower, each ram was a promise. Soon the walls would be tested, not by naked courage, but by crafted machines. Still, time was against them. Hunger gnawed, thirst tormented, and the city loomed untaken. The Crusaders now stood on the knife edge of collapse or triumph, with Jerusalem's fate hanging on whether their towers could reach its proud ramparts. By early July 1099, the Crusaders were nearing breaking point. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Water remained scarce, and the defenders of Jerusalem rained down arrows, stones, and scorn from the walls. The siege towers were rising, but morale wavered with each passing day. Then, when hope seemed thinnest, the leaders turned to faith, a weapon as powerful as any sword. Clergy and preachers proclaimed that the army's suffering was a divine test. To take the holy city, they declared, the Crusaders must purify themselves. On July 8th, barefoot and unarmed, thousands of soldiers, nobles, and priests marched in solemn procession around the city walls. Relics of saints were carried high, hymns were sung, and psalms echoed across the dry hills. At their head was Peter the Hermit, the fiery preacher whose voice had once stirred Europe to take up the cross. Now he led them in penance, reminding them that only repentance could win God's favor. From the battlements, Muslim defenders watched in disbelief as their enemies turned siege into spectacle. To them, it looked like madness. But to the Crusaders, the act was transformative. Men who had been bitter rivals wept together, confessed sins, and swore to fight with renewed unity. Chroniclers later wrote that the spectacle mirrored the biblical march around Jericho, and they believed as those ancient walls had fallen, so too would Jerusalem's. The impact on morale was immediate. Soldiers returned to their labor on the towers with fresh zeal. Even the sick and weak found new energy, convinced heaven itself now walked beside them. Within days, a Genoese fleet arrived at Jaffa, bringing craftsmen, iron, and supplies. To the Crusaders, it seemed like divine confirmation that God had accepted their penance. The siege engines were strengthened, wheels bound in iron, hides stretched across frames to resist fire. Inside the city, defenders prepared for the coming storm. They filled jars with oil and pitch to hurl down on the towers, sharpened spears, and readied stones for their catapults. But outside the walls, the Crusaders' camp burned with holy fervor. The procession had changed the siege from a desperate gamble into a holy mission, giving starving men the conviction that the walls of Jerusalem would soon fall, not by strength alone, but by the will of God. On July 13th, 1099, the waiting ended. With siege towers complete and rams ready, the Crusaders launched their full assault on Jerusalem. Trumpets blared, drums beat, and cries of Deo's vault, God wills it, rolled like thunder across the parched valley. Men who had starved for weeks now hurled themselves at the walls with a ferocity born of desperation and belief. The defenders met them with equal fury. Arrows hissed from the battlements, stones crashed down, and pots of burning oil and pitch exploded against wooden frames. The great siege towers creaked forward, groaning under the weight of men and armor. Every step was contested. Defenders set fire to bundles of brush, hoping to ignite the towers before they touched the walls. Crusaders rushed with buckets of water, shields overhead, dousing flames as quickly as they spread. Godfrey of Boulogne directed his tower against the northern wall, while Raymond of Toulouse pressed hard from the south. The strategy was simple: overwhelm the defenders with multiple points of attack, forcing them to scatter their strength. At night, the towers were rolled closer under cover of darkness, and rams battered the gates with iron-tipped fury. But the walls of Jerusalem, built to withstand empires, held firm. The fighting was relentless. Chroniclers tell of men collapsing from heat stroke, dragging themselves up again to climb ladders. Arrows blackened the sky, and the air was thick with smoke and screams. Crusaders hurled stones and bolts from the towers, trying to clear space on the ramparts for an assault. Defenders fought back with grappling hooks and poles, shoving ladders away, sending armored men tumbling to their deaths. For 2 days, the battle raged without decisive progress. The Crusaders' engines burned, their soldiers faltered, and the defenders mocked their failure from the walls. But on July 15th, the tide turned. Godfrey's engineers mounted wheels on their tower, shifting its position in the night to a weaker section of wall near the northeast. When dawn came, the defenders found themselves facing the tower in a place where their fortifications were thin and vulnerable. The Crusaders pressed with renewed determination. The assault had become more than war. It was apocalypse, salvation and vengeance bound together. Jerusalem trembled as the Crusaders prepared for one last push. A push that would either deliver the city into their hands or leave their bones scattered beneath its walls. On the morning of July 15th, 1099, the final assault reached its climax. Godfrey of Boulogn's great siege tower rolled forward, its wheels screeching across scorched earth. The defenders on the northern wall braced for impact, but the Crusaders had shifted the tower during the night to a weaker point near the northeast corner. As the sun rose, the massive structure loomed against the walls like a wooden mountain. Arrows rained from the top of the tower, clearing a path. Behind its protective screens, men worked furiously, lowering drawbridges and pushing scaling ladders against the battlements. At last, the moment came. Crusaders surged across the tower's gangway, clashing with defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Shields locked, swords swung, and bodies tumbled from the ramparts. Godfrey himself is said to have been among the first to set foot on the walls, leading by example. Chroniclers described him loosing arrows from his bow and driving his men onward. With every minute, the defenders lost ground. Then, in a pivotal strike, one Crusader cut down the standard of the Fatimids, raising the cross in its place. The sight electrified the besiegers below, who roared with renewed fervor. Meanwhile, on the southern front, Raymond of Toulouse's forces battered the walls near Mount Zion. Though they struggled against fierce resistance, the distraction kept defenders divided, preventing them from focusing all strength on Godfrey's assault. By midday, the northern wall was compromised. Crusaders poured into the city like a flood, scaling ladders, forcing gates, and smashing through doors. Inside, chaos erupted. Defenders retreated through narrow streets, pursued by the relentless invaders. Panic spread among Jerusalem's inhabitants, Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians alike. As the Crusaders broke through, the holy city, fortified and proud, had finally been breached. For the Crusaders, the moment was both triumph and vindication. After years of hunger, peril, and unimaginable struggle, they had set foot inside the city they had sworn to reclaim. The walls of Jerusalem, thought impregnable, had fallen not just to steel and timber, but to the fiery conviction of an army that believed God himself willed their victory. But what followed would turn triumph into horror, a massacre that would scar the memory of Jerusalem for centuries to come. Once the walls of Jerusalem were breached on July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders poured into the city and the streets ran red. What began as triumph swiftly descended into slaughter. Chroniclers, both Christian and Muslim, describe scenes of horror that stunned even contemporaries hardened by years of war. Driven by religious zeal, vengeance, and the raw fury of survival, the Crusaders cut down all who crossed their path. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians were struck down in the chaos as the invaders swept from house to house. In the courtyard of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, thousands were killed. One Crusader source, Raymond of Aguilers, wrote that the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. To the Crusaders, this was divine justice to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. It was apocalypse. No quarter was given. Homes were set ablaze, treasures looted, and holy sites desecrated. Jews who had taken refuge in their synagogue were burned alive when the building was set alight. Muslim defenders and civilians alike were cut down in alleys and markets. Even livestock was slaughtered in the frenzy. The cries of the dying mingled with the chants of Crusaders who believed they were cleansing the city for God. Yet amidst the carnage, symbolism guided their steps. Crusaders rushed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre where they fell to their knees, praying and weeping in gratitude. For them, the massacre was not mere butchery, but the purging of Jerusalem, reclaiming it for Christendom after centuries of Islamic rule. In their eyes, blood was the price of sanctity. For the wider Muslim world, the massacre became a wound that never healed. News of the slaughter spread quickly across the Middle East, shocking rulers and commoners alike. Jerusalem, revered as the third holiest city in Islam, had not just been captured, but defiled. The brutality seared itself into memory, fueling a cycle of vengeance that would dominate the centuries to come. In victory, the Crusaders believed they had fulfilled God's will. But their triumph was stained in rivers of blood, and the massacre of 1099 would echo as one of the darkest chapters in the long struggle for the Holy City. In the days after Jerusalem fell, the chaos slowly gave way to order, at least from the perspective of the conquerors. The slaughter had left the city eerily silent, its streets littered with corpses, and its wells and systems choked with blood. But to the Crusaders, this was a holy cleansing. They believed they had delivered Jerusalem back into the hands of Christendom. And now the question loomed: how should it be ruled? The first step was sanctification. Barefoot Crusaders processed to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, washing its floors and rededicating it to Christian worship. Priests celebrated Mass over the very site they believed marked Christ's tomb. Relics were raised high and hymns echoed through walls still scarred by battle. For the victors, this was the climax of their pilgrimage, proof that their sacrifices had been blessed by God. But politics quickly followed piety. With Jerusalem conquered, leadership had to be settled. Raymond of Toulouse, one of the wealthiest and most ambitious lords, refused the crown, claiming he would not wear a crown of gold where Christ had worn one of thorns. The mantle then passed to Godfrey of Bouillon, who accepted the role, but styled himself not king, but advocate of the Holy Sila. His title reflected both humility and strategy. Jerusalem was to be seen not as a secular kingdom, but as the earthly stronghold of Christendom itself. Under this new Latin rule, Jerusalem was reshaped. Mosques were converted into churches, Islamic sacred spaces stripped of their treasures, and new laws enforced. The city became the heart of the Crusader states, a Latin Christian enclave carved into the Muslim world. Pilgrims from Europe now had a destination secured by knights, and the Crusaders began fortifying their conquest, aware that Muslim powers would not leave the loss unchallenged for long. Yet beneath the triumph lay fragility. The Crusader garrison was small, resources were thin, and enemies surrounded them. The Fatimid Caliphate to the south and the Seljuk Turks to the east both viewed Jerusalem's fall as intolerable. Though the city now bore the cross upon its towers, it would remain under constant threat. The establishment of Crusader rule was not the end of the struggle for Jerusalem, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would define the relationship between Christian and Muslim powers for generations. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 was more than a military victory. It was an event that reshaped the medieval world. For the Crusaders, it was the fulfillment of a divine mission. After 3 brutal years of marching, starving, and fighting, they had seized the holiest city in Christendom. Chroniclers in Europe hailed them as heroes, their triumph celebrated in churches from Rome to Paris. The First Crusade had succeeded beyond expectation, proving that Christendom could unite and achieve what seemed impossible. But to the Muslim world, the siege was a catastrophe. News of the massacre spread swiftly across Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Jerusalem, sacred to Islam as the site of the Prophet's night journey, had been bathed in blood. For many Muslims, the loss was both a humiliation and a call to arms. The memory of 1099 became a rallying point for resistance, shaping leaders like Zeni, Nur-ad-Din, and ultimately Saladin, who would vow to restore the city to Islamic rule. For the Jewish communities of Jerusalem, the siege was an unspeakable tragedy. Many were slaughtered in the synagogue fires or hunted in the chaos, and survivors carried tales of horror into exile. Their suffering became another scar in the long story of persecution that marked Jewish life in the medieval world. Politically, the conquest created something new, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. With Godfrey of Bouillon as its first ruler, the city became the capital of the Crusade estates. fragile outposts of Western Christendom in the heart of the Middle East. Castles rose on the hills, knights garrisoned the roads, and pilgrims began streaming toward the holy Cephala under the protection of their fellow Christians. Yet the kingdom was always precarious, surrounded by hostile powers, and dependent on reinforcements from Europe. Culturally, the siege hardened attitudes on both sides. In Europe, tales of miraculous victories fueled the idea that God's hand guided the Crusades. In the Islamic world, the massacre of Jerusalem burned into collective memory as a crime demanding vengeance. The clash of faiths became more than territorial. It was spiritual, existential, and destined to last for centuries. The siege of 1099 was not just the bloody capture of a city. It was the spark that ignited 200 years of crusades, a cycle of holy war and reprisal that would scar the medieval world. Jerusalem had been taken, but peace had been lost. Its stones still bore the weight of both victory and vengeance.